Okay, the recording started. All right, so thank you everyone for coming, and we're very excited to have Maya present your, a presentation, to make a presentation based on your wonderful thesis, absolutely wonderful, and it's titled "Experiences of Truth: A Comparative Contemplation of Jainism and the Western Psychedelic Experience."
Thank you. Okay, so we're currently in the midst of a psychedelic renaissance, which is a science-focused movement. This movement centered on discovering the potential healing benefits of psychedelic medicines. So with this movement comes the reinvigoration of psychedelic scholarship in various academic disciplines. So in religious studies, a recent area of interest is the intersection between Eastern spirituality and psychedelics. So what is it about psychedelic states that correlate with the philosophical content of Indian meditation? Four key figures from both movements. And through this method, I explored how these religio-intellectual movements acted as forces of spiritual revolution and how this transformed the layperson's role in respective society. So I guess my main thesis and conclusion kind of statement of my research is by utilizing non-ordinary states of consciousness, arguing the ineffability of truth, reconsidering their respective society or their respective religious and philosophical status quo, and advocating philosophical pluralism and equanimity, these mystics enunciated the corresponding goal of reclaiming the self as the supreme source of religious authority. Okay, so some motivations for my research. So like I said before, scholarship has explored connections between psychedelic mysticism and other Indian traditions. So Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism have been compared to psychedelics. And a core text from this movement is The Psychedelic Experience. I don't know, the Timothy Leary book. So this is really a core text from this movement. And it's one of the first scholarly attempts to examine the psychedelic experience and Eastern philosophy comparatively. So yeah, that book is just a big inspiration about why I would want to compare psychedelics. So also another motive I had is I wanted to legitimize the intellectual integrity of psychedelic mysticism and academia. So by juxtaposing psychedelic philosophy with Jainism, I wanted to demonstrate the analytical merit and legitimate religiosity of this kind of academically marginalized tradition. So while I was navigating this comparison, I wanted to proceed with caution when it came to imposing Western terminology onto the South Asian tradition. So to combat this, I attempted to place Western psychedelic philosophy into Jain categorization. So throughout my work, I used terms to categorize metaphysical realizations experienced by psychonauts with Jain terms. So for example, pramana, which is a valid means of acquiring knowledge. Sorry. Okay, so so pramana, which is a valid means of knowledge, refers to knowledge obtained directly through the self and without mediation through senses or the mind. So this can kind of be used to also categorize some of the realizations experienced by psychonauts during their trips. So another reason why I wanted to study this was because there's been like generous academic attention given to the ritual use of entheogens in indigenous religions. And there hasn't really been any like serious academic research done on like kind of like, I don't want to say the word white, but like kind of just like what has occurred in the 60s and stuff. No one's really studied that with like a religious studies lens. And also, to my knowledge, there's only one published work on Jainism and psychedelics, and this was a very small excerpt from a book that was written in the 80s. So moving on, since I'm starting this discussion of psychedelics and Jainism, I feel it's important for me to bring up the issue of pramada in Jainism. So the Jain view of pramada, or carelessness and negligence, it comes from the Jain's very complex system for understanding karma. So I feel like it was necessary for me to acknowledge this if I was going to compare these two things. So according to the Jain tradition, lay people are expected to abide by various householder vows. The function of the vows is twofold. The observance of vows will prevent the accumulation of negative karma, and also through the abstinence of sin, it will maintain peace and safety in society. So if Jains were to slack on these vows, they're subject to one of the 7 tattvas, or the reals of reality. And one of these is ashrava, which is the influx of karma. So there's 2 types of these. And the one I'm interested in is bhavasrava, which is caused by the activities of the 5 senses and an impure mind. So this is the categorization that pramada really like follows. So according to an important Jain text, the Tattvartha Sutra, there are 15 types of pramada one can partake in, and one of these is the ingestion of alcohol or drugs. So in the Jain view, actions like the ingestion of alcohol or drugs will lead to further karmic impedance in one's emancipation. And it doesn't allow one to have complete control over their observance of the Jain vows or of the 4 passions and their senses. So this begs the question, so if this is the sentiment towards drugs in Jainism, why try to compare the philosophy from this tradition to one that explicitly requires the use of psychedelic substances? So this is where I argue that I have 2 reasons for doing so. So there's already a prevalence of psychoactive substances in Indian religions. So for example, cannabis has been used in the form of bhang, ganja, and charas in Hindu ritual settings since approximately 1000 BC. The Artha Veda also considers cannabis to be one of the 5 most sacred plants on earth. So then as for the Shramana traditions, which Jainism belongs to, there's this scholar, Michael Crowley, who brings up evidence that early Tibetan Buddhist groups were also ingesting psychedelic sacraments. So that leads into my second reason why I compare these 2. So the question, what if psychedelic drugs are not mind altering, but mind awakening? So in this book where Michael Crowley brings up how early Tibetan groups could have ingested psychedelic sacraments, he says that maybe we're understanding the definition of psychedelics wrong in this context. So rather than clouding the mind by intoxication, psychedelics act as agents that clear the mind, to understand ayahuasca religion in the Netherlands to psychonauts' overall spiritual use of psychedelics in the West. So I argue that this spiritual phenomena can be called a religion because it has the ability to connect the experiencer to mystically induced states directly. There are no central authorities to convene with, no common meeting place, and no essential religious texts. Yet this psychedelic phenomena still possesses a religious nature. I consider psychedelic mysticism to be a religion or like a religion because of the one central practice, which is the ingestion of this sacrament. And theoretically, psychedelic religion forces us to reconsider preconceived notions about the definition of religion. So due to religious assumptions stemming from Christian theological influence, Western scholarship tends to view religion as a phenomena or established tradition that is concerned with the relationship between humans and the supernatural grace of a superior divine being. So in this definition, authentic religious practice concerns divine grace given by a transcendent God and received by lowly humans. All other spiritual practices that stray away from this definition are seen as other and irreligious. So psychedelic mysticism initiates reconsiderations of this because in this religious view, humans can directly access and influence divinity through their own religious practice. Divinity is not transcendent or out of bounds. When one voluntarily undergoes a psychedelic induced mystical state, they use their will to access divinity, spiritual healing, and religiosity directly. And then methodologically, psychedelic religion provides new insight into discussing scholarship's ability to examine the experiential dimension of religion. So not only is it imperative for us to reconsider the impossibility of studying direct experience, but we must acknowledge that psychedelic mysticism is just as religiously efficient as more traditional forms of mysticism. With this research, I aimed to demonstrate that traditional modes of understanding religion need to be reframed when studying the content of psychedelic writers. So I'm not saying that there are no inevitable limitations when analyzing another person's non-ordinary state, but I think that we can review the empirical data left behind by these believers. And that's the substance we can analyze to look at the subjective effects of their experience. And then my third point, this religious scholar, Morgan Shipley, brings up the theory of how in Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, he established a type of psychonautic topography. So Huxley set the stage for other psychedelic mystics to express themselves. This system challenges typical modes of studying religion because, unlike normal Western philosophical frameworks, it is non-discursive, non-dualistic, and non-utilitarian in thinking. So in psychedelic religion, this experience does not end once the effect of the drugs wear off. The religious and ethical wisdom is gained after these experiences. And I think the value in studying them is how they're spiritually understood. So directly opposing a positive approach, I argue that by phenomenologically viewing the philosophical writings of psychonauts and even Idiotmies, we're given a slight peek into the experience of these mystics. So going into a little background information. So the Adhyatma movement. So the word Adhyatma is a Sanskrit compound that combines the terms adhi and atman. So it translates to concerning the soul. So this movement was a philosophical movement that existed during the 17th to 19th century. And it composed various Jain mystical poets and philosophers from both traditions. So this philosophy is concerned with reconsidering religious institutions, the faults of logocentric knowledge, and the role of the individual in spiritual guidance and liberation. So rather than depending on external religious authority and the Sangha, Adhyatma vernacular poets champion self-reliance through the experience of Svasamaya, or the Para Atman, which is the pure true self, the soul. And the two Adhyatmis I've picked for my analysis are Kunda Kunda and Anandagan. Okay, so Kunda Kunda wrote this very important text in Jainism called the Samaya Sutta, and it advised many Jains about the nature of the self and the innate potential to derive knowledge directly from this experience of the Para Atman, the self. So he proposed a Jain logical model, which is a two-perspective model. According to this model, all things can be analyzed from two perspectives or nayas. So while ultimate truth pertains to ultimate perspective, the practical way of looking at things is necessary to make right choices and progress and liberation. So these two perspectives are the mundane point of view, which is our everyday point of view, and then this ultimate absolute point of view. So to Kunda Kunda, no practice or a material affair compares to the inner truth of the Para Atman. So focusing on his use of refutation to allude to the experience of the self and truth, I attempt to uncover the philosophical and spiritual implications of what he has to say. And then Anandagan. So he was an Adhyatmi hymnist, and there's little to no historical information regarding his life, but in spite of this, the content, style, and nature of his poetry suggests he lived around mid-17th century. So unlike other late medieval Jains who lived in worshiping communities, Anandagan's poetry suggests he lived a nomadic life where he spent just as much time with non-Jains and other religious poets and seekers as he did with Jain monks and lay people. So he emphasized the direct experience of the self. He championed the view that the Atma Anubhava, the experience of the self, is the true source of knowledge, and he uses complex metaphor to help facilitate his audience's awakening towards this true self. His songs reflect an anti-institutional approach, and they center on freelance asceticism, meditation, and tantric poetry. Okay, so the Western psychedelic movement, I use the word psychonaut to describe these like believers or followers of this faith. So the word psychonaut was first used by a German author in 1970 to describe a person who journeys through the mind and consciousness, typically through the ingestion of psychedelics. And it's a combination of the Greek words psyche and nautes. So it means a sailor of the soul. And similar to the Adhyatma movement, psychedelic mysticism and the philosophy that these men brought asserted that the self is the premier source of spiritual knowledge and authority. Participants of this movement adhered to counter-revolutionary ideas, societal hierarchies, and the utilization of non-ordinary states of consciousness. So they advocated for direct experience and the birthright to mystically explore one's inner self. So the two men that I chose were Terence McKenna and Alan Watts. So Terence McKenna was an ethnobotanist and very proud proponent of the psilocybin mushroom. So throughout his career as a psychonautic mystic, McKenna authored various books pertaining to mushroom cultivation, the evolution of human consciousness, metaphysics, and culture. He argued that mushrooms were the source of humanity's first religious ideas, and that entheogens would lead to the next evolutionary step for humanity. He also argued that the psychedelic experience has impressive problem-solving capabilities, and he repeatedly stressed the importance of directly experiencing the dissolution of this mundane ego. So then Alan Watts was a philosopher from England who he kind of brought Eastern thought to like the Western public, and he presented it in a way that I think wasn't really done before, because he made it in a way that was relatable. So I feel that investigation of his work was critical to my discussion, because he's a prime example of the intersection between psychedelic thought and Eastern religion. So after he experienced and experimented with LSD, cannabis, and mescaline, he ventured on to study religious philosophy in Zen Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism. His work helps to illuminate that the revelations experienced during a psychedelic journey incite as existential harmony and awareness. So going on into my main argument, both of these groups advocated for the individual's right to attain perennial knowledge through the utilization of non-ordinary states of consciousness as epistemological sources. So the Adhyatmis did so by utilizing tantric poetry and dhyana, or meditation, as spiritual vehicles to reach non-ordinary states of consciousness. So to the Adhyatmis, seekers must look inward for spiritual knowledge and guidance. Unlike other Jain teachers of this time who stressed ritual conduct, Kunda Kunda and Anandagan asserted that religious practice does not supersede the potency of self-exploration. So their desired non-ordinary state of consciousness was the Para Atman, or the pure self. So Kunda Kunda's work focuses on the Atman Anubhava, which is the experience of the self, and his use of discriminative wisdom to get there. So Kunda Kunda communicates that inner visions of truth, though they're not easily or instantly attained, are within reach to all through the experience. He alludes that the Atman Anubhava, by refuting qualities that are not of the soul, help one realize the intrinsic attributes of the soul. And this is what he calls discriminative wisdom. So by discerning the pure self from the empirical ego, one can know the true soul and rid themselves of karmic bondage and eventually obtain a liberation. So Anandagan, rather than using this form of refutation meditation, he used Jain tantric poetry and complex imagery So although Jainism does not have a structured tantric path, certain aspects of Tantra existed during this time. So Jainism is not considered to be a tantric tradition, but I took from Ellen Go's development of the process of tantrization and saw this as a saw Ananda songs as a
recording automatically. I think it happened once and then I immediately clicked. Did you see it again?
Yeah.
Happen again?
No, I saw it
Yeah,
that
so- and
once.
then I-
So
and
I
then
kept checking again. and again.
Me too. I kept checking. So I think it's probably okay.
we
Okay.
just need to turn the camera and audio on.
Like, well, something with the internet here, so. All right, hopefully we can continue. Okay, thank you, Maya, sorry.
Okay. So I was talking about Anandagan. Okay,
Yes.
so so yeah, his bhakti expression was a form of devotion to the cloud of bliss, which is the Pada Atman, which is the supreme self within all living beings. Okay, so discovering truth in the psychonaut tradition. So 20th century psychonauts accessed non-ordinary states of consciousness through psychedelic substances. So to them, perennial knowledge was attainable to all through this experience. And in order to gain epistemological insight, all one had to do was embark on this psychedelic experience. So, for McKenna, psychoactive tryptamines, which are DMT mushrooms, they beckon our attention. They teach that the only spiritual path worth following champions personal experience and dialogue. In one of his numerous public lectures on psychedelics, McKenna describes these drugs as a siren song calling us back to what is authentic, what is real. When taken responsibly and with honest curiosity, these tryptamines act as spiritual vehicles that bring the experiencer to the realization that the only experience that matters is your own. So McKenna, he saw psychedelics as spiritual vehicles that allow us to be touched by what he calls the cosmic giggle. He also postulated the stone ape theory, and this theory suggests that mushrooms led and continue to lead to evolutionary advantages in human beings. So the non-ordinary states induced by psilocybin provide humans with religious impulses and symbolic imagination. McKenna saw this psychedelic experience as an evolutionary catalyst that served as an epistemological tool that enabled us to be directly touched by what he calls the cosmic giggle. And by dissolving boundaries upheld by the ego and cultural programming, psychedelics give the individual seeker direct contact with the unknown, the soul, and authentic religious experience. Alan Watts believed that psychedelics were tools that helped one gain preliminary mystical insight. He likened the psychedelic experience to a phone call. He said, if you get the message, hang up the phone. This is why he went on to studying Eastern traditions, because he felt that psychedelics gave him what he needed to move forward on his path of mysticism. So he believes that as long as these powerful substances were taken seriously and respectfully while under favorable conditions, they could deliver profound, genuine mystical insight. So as an instrument, they deliver a transformation of the self through the realization and the feeling of the soul or God. He says, I'm not looking at the world, not confronting it. I am knowing it by a continuous process of transforming it into myself so that everything around me, the whole globe of space, no longer feels away from me, but in the middle. So, an issue with psychedelics in academia is its criticisms that this is a type of instant, mysticism. It's not genuine and true like other traditions. So a common criticism is that they're naive, they're unstable means to an end, and that they're not as yielding because they don't require much effort or spiritual training. This scholar, Arthur Versluis, I think is how you pronounce it, he brought up this idea of immediatism. So in the 1950s and 60s, many psychonautic revolutionists were proclaiming a sudden sense of spiritual belonging and purpose, a religious assertion of spontaneous, direct, unmediated spiritual insight into reality. Some of them termed it as enlightenment. So this means of obtaining enlightenment may not seem like it's as sophisticated as traditional other modes, but I argue that this is not the case. So like the Atman Anubhava, psychonauts use the psychedelic experience as a means to obtain true knowledge. The psychedelic experience is not something effortless. It's not something that's easy to endure. It is mentally, physically, and spiritually arduous. Everyday perceptions of self, emotion, time, space, movement, reality are reevaluated at a level imperceptible to our everyday consciousness. Again, psychedelics are not semantically synonymous with intoxicants. Rather than dull the senses and cause addiction, psychedelics sharpen the senses to a supernatural degree of awareness. They deliver an intense experience that requires a lot of courage, endurance, and flexibility from a person. The lessons received during a trip can be so much to process that psychonauts do not touch them for months or years after their experience, like Watts. After the experience, they report having these strong feelings of spiritual transformation. And with psychedelics as a means of exploration, these psychonauts felt that they were returning back to authentic knowledge. So with the issue of the limitations of language and conceptual reality, since these two traditions saw true knowledge as lived experience, they also had the idea that mystical knowledge could not be directly communicated. So any communication of this experience through language was only partially expressing truth. So they both advocated the individual's right to perennial knowledge through the philosophical emphasis on the ineffability of the experience and truth. So using Rahul Parson, a Jain scholar's analysis of ineffability in Adhyatma literature, I kind of use this specific understanding of the ineffable, one that resists language and logocentrism as sources of delusion and conflict. I use this definition to frame both the psychonaut and Adhyatmi understanding of ineffability. So Kunda Kunda, for him, language was an act of the Parasamaya, or the empirical ego, and the Vyavaharanaya, which is the conventional viewpoint, our mundane point of view. So from his understanding, we can describe the conditions and modifications of the soul from our everyday egos. However, these conditions point to the verbal differentiations used to describe the soul in this mundane reality. They don't point to the absolute reality of the soul. The soul can't be grasped by this mundane view and can only truly be understood by the experience of the Atmananubhava. He says that this blissful, omniscient nature of the pure self is free from the shackles of description. And then Anandagan argues that language contributes to a type of one-sided opinion, bias, and conflict on this path to spiritual liberation. In one of his songs, he sings, "The advocate of a standpoint clutches at straws, my dear. He makes places of fighting. A substance perceptible by inner experience, that's the way to know him. The great king, the cloud of bliss, my dear, isn't one to say or hear. What sign shall I indicate then? Through speech his form is not perceptible." So this song propounds this belief that the Atman, this great king, or this cloud of bliss, cannot be perceived or transmitted through a logocentric medium like language. His metaphor of an advocate of a standpoint in this specific song could be maybe a jab at an individual who upholds this one-sided point of view, or it maybe could be a critique of language itself. So Anandagan and Kunda Kundan's emphasis on ineffability of truth and experience ensure that religious knowledge stays outside of doctrinal power. Since this experience cannot be taught, the mystical knowledge of truth does not stay contained in an esoteric monkhood or a text. It stays inside the inner world of the individual. So like the Adhyatmis, psychonauts also had an issue with language's ability to show truth. So it's important to note that the psychedelic experience is not the same every time, and the quality and descriptions that are attributed to the mystical visions vary depending on the individual, the dosage, the substance, and the set and setting. So a religious experience on psychedelics can be challenging to describe because language is no longer a valuable tool for communicating this phenomena. So Watts claims that during the psychedelic experience, this superconscious method of thinking becomes conscious. We see the world as the whole body sees it, and for this very reason, there's great difficulty in attempting to translate the mode of vision into a form of language that is based on contrast and classification. Like Anandagan's view, when language is used to describe mystical visions, it creates a divided opinion and conflict. Watt's notion of the whole body is similar to the Nishkaya perspective, which is the perspective of the soul. Under this experience, the whole body has an omniscient point of view that sees the world with absolute truth. Like the Nishkaya perspective, the superconscious perspective of the whole body cannot be translated through words. And then Terence McKenna says that psychedelics kind of pull and melt and recast language, which he calls an illusion-producing machinery. And this alludes to his experience of ego death, which can be described as a complete loss of a typical sense of self. It's when the I inside can talk no more and is gone, cannot form thoughts, but is simply a part of all that is and is no longer separate. These feelings of subjectivity cannot be conveyed by systematic reasoning or linguistic expression. In one of Terence's lectures, he states that the sense of self-transformation brought on after the experience of ego death is not something you can get from scripture, ideology, or any outside teacher. So another thing that Adyatmis and psychonauts did was they advocated the individual's right through the reconsideration of their respective societies' religious and philosophical status quo. They also advocated for a philosophical position of pluralism and a feeling of equanimity. They both campaigned for self-exploration as a means to knowledge and liberation. So Adyatmis went against the grain of typical Jain orthopraxy, and they believed that one's spiritual options should not be limited to logocentrism or instructed religious knowledge by a monk or a guru. So since the soul is understood to be synonymous with correct knowledge, Kunda Kunda says those who are outside the presence of the Supreme Self, even though they observe the vows, restraints, and rules of conduct and practice of austerities, they are devoid of right knowledge. So he invited Jains to reconsider the sincerity of institutional sources of knowledge from Jainism. He introduced the idea that the internal processes of will and intention supersede external action. If one's convictions and their intentions are not in accordance with the knowledge that's gained from the Atmananubhava, then karmic bondage will ensue. For him, one is not truly in good faith if they act by routine. For him, even the most learned and ritually trained monk does not stop the influx of karma and progress in the path to moksha, if he has not realized the true source of mystical knowledge, which is the self. And Anandagan's mystical poetry challenged popular Jain notions of asceticism as well. They also showed evidence of interreligious dialogue and empowered self-revelations over guru-disciple relationships. And this is reflected in one of his songs where he says, "The supreme being is different from the visible world. In the pot of the body, the window is subtle. With the practice of the self, the exceptional shines and glimpses the pole star. Ascetic, why are you sleeping in the body's temple? Wake up, look in the vessel." So similar to the countercultural nature of the Adyatmis and their Atmananubhava, psychonauts used psychedelics and the experience to reclaim religious authority, to be in favor of them as the individuals. So even though classic psychedelics that were used by Watts and Terence McKenna were classified by the United Nations as like classified drugs, they still continued to advocate for the powerful benefit of them. They countered claims that said there was no potential for medical or spiritual use, and they countered this by saying that there was spiritual and healing potential of this experience. So Terence McKenna argues that psilocybin-induced mystical experiences are a source of true gnosis for the modern man. Unlike the answers and opinions of dominant politics in society, the voices of the mushroom hold promising problem-solving ability. He claimed that during his visions that he had under mushrooms, that they gave him solutions to problems that plague all of humanity, like world population, scarcity of resources, and environmental destruction. He advocated that through a simple mushroom trip, a person could realize patterns in their behavior and thinking that may contribute to these societal issues. For McKenna, the psychedelic experience shows that we should not assume that world problems are insoluble. And going on to Watts, he argued that hegemonic political and philosophical opinions about psychedelics' morality, qualitative effects, and genuine religiosity are hypocritical and unfounded. His position saw that these social institutions cannot maintain control if an individual's perspective is shifted from mainstream thought. So for Watts, these experiences allow the individual to awaken from a culture that idealizes good over bad and makes people feel guilty about themselves. So revolution towards non-absolutism and equanimity. So a distinct quality of both of these experiences is the awakening of an individual's understanding of their place in the world and how they relate to other beings. This mystical experience reorients behavior to incorporate greater empathy, understanding, patience, and acceptance. So with Rudolf Otto's theory of mysterium tremendum in mind, I argue that as a mysterium tremendum, the eye-opening experience of awakening from the mundane perspective to a mystical point of view can be humbling and inspire change. So upon awakening in this mystical point of view, both Adyatmis and psychonauts experience a state of samatha or equanimity. By viewing things as they are, they walk forward after these experiences with greater compassion in mind for all life and the conviction that all humanity has the right and ability to experience these truths. So rather than announce themselves as prophets, these mystics accepted the multifaceted nature of truth. They saw that the state of equanimity showed that all appear as equal and that truth is anikant or pluralistic. So Kunda Kunda expressed this through his through the use of syadvad or relativity. So Kunda Kunda elaborated on the essence of anikantvad in the Samaya Sutta, and he displayed that truth is not an exercise of exclusive possession. So the soul may contain the essence of absolute truth, but we are all capable of knowing this soul without any outside mediation. And Anandagan's tantric poetry have also reminiscent themes of anikantvad and samatha. So in his poems about the shackles of of attachment, Anandagan says, equanimity is the daughter of the jewel-giving ocean, her brother the moon of experience. Leave the deadly poison in the cup of worldly existence. Yourself take the nectar. Truthful brother, wander with equanimity. Ascetic, do not be tainted by attachment. In this verse, samatha and anubhava are effects of the Atman, which is this jewel-giving ocean. The moon of experience is the Atman anubhava, the experience of the self. The experience looks over the jewel-giving ocean, which is the Atman, the soul. He urges others to experience the self and enter a state of neutrality and peace. Do not attach yourself to things, instead experience the neutral state of the soul. And in the psychedelic movement, during this experience, psychonauts are susceptible to feelings of mystical unity that are reminiscent of these Jain notions of anikantvad and samatha. The state of mystical unity involves recognition of the oneness of all, in which one finds unity at the core of the inner subjectivity or inner reality of all things, despite the diversity or apparent individual identity and separation of all things. So during this state of harmonious neutralization or samatha, psychonauts begin to see subjectivity or Syadvad as pieces of a puzzle that reflect this absolute nature of truth. After experiencing this state of unity and expanded awareness, psychonauts come back from their trips determined to morally act with a sense of unitive interdependence in mind. So McKenna is reminiscent of Anekantvad because he suggests that one maintains this position of open-minded skepticism, to maintain a position of just a witness. And he directly rejects hegemonic monotheistic philosophies and advocates instead for the individual to avoid allegiance to any one interpretation. He saw allegiance to an ideology as an insult to human free thinking. For him, what humanity needs is a sense of feeling of unity. The notion of equanimity or samatha does not come from ideological institutions, from a feeling derived from a personal act of courage and surrendering. With Alan Watts, the sense of harmony amongst all things, amongst all opposite things that is ignited during the psychedelic experience produces a deep sense of compassion. Through this experience of samatha, Watts gained an ethical insight. Rather than inflating a false sense of self, he claims that this sensation forms a basis for social love and order. He says, at root, there's simply no way of separating self from other, self-love from other love. All knowledge of self is knowledge of other, and all knowledge of other knowledge of self, and the features of everything foreign, threatening, terrifying, and incomprehensible and remote, I begin to recognize myself. So, the moral authority an individual gains during these experiences is constructed from a view of compassion that sees intrinsic harmony amongst all things. Rather than relying on outside institutions to provide a moral compass, Adyatmis and psychonauts advocated the use of mystical experience to reach inner realizations of plurality, equanimity amongst all beings. So my conclusions. So William James theorizes that individual religious experiences are central to all religions. He says we learn more from mystics and prophets than we do from the conventionally religious. And so far, I feel that this work has surveyed how Adyatmis and psychonauts have complemented this theory by placing deep mystical experience at the center of all religion. Rather than relying on centralized religious belief and practice to guide one's spiritual progression, Adyatmis and psychonauts relied on self-referential knowledge gained by this mystical experience. They promoted the notion that we are all our own gurus. By championing inner exploration as an epistemological source of knowledge, they empowered the role of the individual in religion. With a deep
Yes, Maya, you can, oh, wait, yeah. Yes, you can repeat the last portion, the very last portion, right?
Okay. So with a deep and experienced sense of compassion for life, these mystics felt compelled to share the wealth of mystical exploration. Kunda Kunda summarizes this sentiment beautifully by saying, the self, which mounted on the chariot of knowledge, roams about as it pleases, shedding the light of wisdom.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maya. It was a stellar presentation.
Thank
If
you.
you haven't read the thesis, you really just laid down
Yeah.
all the important points and all the wonderful insights that you had. And it's definitely just a wonderful thesis for many reasons. And one of them I want to acknowledge, Maya, is that it's a very courageous undertaking. Because comparing, Jainism with the psychedelic, religion of psychonauts or psychedelic experiences is definitely very brave, and it's very hard to do it well, because it's easy to reduce one tradition to the other, or the other to reducing them really to each other, or misrepresenting them. And I think you did an amazing job of being kind of as transparent and as honest with dealing with each of the traditions. The fact that you acknowledge pramada, the fact how you brought up some of the important terminology, including this pratyaksha pramana, the direct perception, the experience of direct perception and valid knowledge, and that that I found in your, that's not, you mentioned that earlier, but one of the threads that I found key to, both the traditions, the way you spoke about them, is the idea of freedom. I think, you don't quite speak about it explicitly, but everything you say is kind of is indicating there's a relationship between religion and freedom. Religion is often understood as constrainment, as a way of constraining, of creating a framework, of putting one in a certain pattern. And I think you just identified these very many streams within both of these religions that point to freedom from authority, or freedom to, freedom from and freedom to freedom to trust, freedom to rely on yourself and trust yourself, freedom from mediators, institutions, from societal pressures, and in both of these traditions, indeed, we find that. And this is, I think, very enlightening and very insightful, something that we tend to overlook oftentimes. And I really appreciate that. And another thing I think is also very, important in your work is that your kind of attempt to redefine our understanding of religion. And I love, I really appreciated your allusion of how reductive the definition of religion is, and how it is based in this Eurocentric, Euro-Christian, 17th, 18th century, and for the 19th century conceptions about what religion should look like. And you, again, in a very substantiated way, show how religion can be understood differently, and how this type of mysticism, we should include into into one of those categories that we take seriously, and not just discard it as some weird expression, or some mysticism or sect or superstition that's not worth looking at. So I think it's wonderful. And another thing I just want to point out is that it's completely Maya's work to find out the ideas of Atmanubhava or Svasamaya. That wasn't me doing. And she actually looked through the text, found out these conceptions, understood them very well, and found the way to use them to talk about the psychedelic experiences. And I really want to commend you on that, because for me, myself, I was like, wow, that is brilliant. It's just brilliant. So thank you very much for that. And in terms of questions, I just want to point out that you're talking about this revival, revival of psychedelics and psychedelic experiences. And I don't know if you heard about Carl Hart from Columbia University. He authored a book. He's a neuroscientist and psychologist from Columbia University, a professor, and he authored a book, Drug Use for Adults, in which he confessed that he had been using heroin for the past 5 years, and he's not. He claims that he has no addiction. He's a responsible adult. He has a family. He's a professor. He's actually a highly acclaimed professor of neuroscience, and he has a lot of very interesting research that kind of undermines, not only psychedelics. I mean, heroin is not even a psychedelic drug, right? It's much serious. And of course, that's not me trying to advocate for the drug, because I use them, and I actually don't support the use of them from my personal perspective, because I have like intense fear of that. But what I'm trying to say is that it is indeed a very relevant field. Field that is developing, and I think that has a lot of kind of future. And if you decide to go forward, studying and doing research in that direction, then I think there is so much to do, because neuroscientists and psychologists and psychiatrists are beginning to be invested in particularly finding the healing, as you said, healing benefits from those of drug use. And he himself, Carl Hart, argues that this drug use helps him to be more compassionate. I think he said altruist and grateful. That's what he says. So my point here is that I guess my question here is that if you see yourself doing something going forward, where would you look into? Would you go, deeper into the study of specifically psychedelic experiences and psychonauts? Or do you think that the kind of bringing in some of this Asian material, particularly in Taoism, of course, is so conducive to doing that, because they've been ingesting drugs for over 2,000 years. So it's a perfect tradition to study. But like traditions like Jainism, who you're right, are really opposed to this kind of altered states of mind. What do you think? Do you think you will continue to engage with that, or do you think it will be something else as you see yourself going forward, unless you didn't think of that, which is fine?
I think after trying to compare, because I thought of the idea, because I was like, I have these two things that I really care about studying, and I have to do like part of it on Jainism. So how am I gonna merge the two? And I'm grateful that I was able to find so much substance and information that I could bridge the gap between them. So I think like maybe going a little bit further and trying to see if there's any more like things I can piece together would be exciting. But I am like more interested in just like studying psychedelics in like modern culture more. So like the fact that we don't really look at, because we're in the midst of it right now, like the psychedelic renaissance is happening now, and there's no one really looking at it as a modern expression of religion in itself. They're looking at all the things that it's like associated with, like new age spirituality, but there's like more condensed pockets that show a lot more deeper religiosity, and it's just psychedelics. So yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, thank you for many things here. First of all, the presentation was very well laid out, and I think was a great sort of condensation of everything that you've written. I don't mind that it didn't have many pictures. I think it was perfect. So, I mean, about your general thesis, there is a lot to admire, and I think there's so much that's really profound about this, and kind of reveals you as a very serious researcher with a serious sense of personal investment in the subject. And that's one thing that came out to me as I was reading. I felt this sense of the sense that your work really meant something to you. And your work, not only with the psychonaut writers, but with your Jain sources, was really engaged with on, I'll use this word, on a spiritual level, in a sense, and that really distinguishes this work and kind of elevates it, I think. It also, I think, should encourage you to take this particular thesis further, I think, in a certain way. I think it does deserve, parts of it do deserve to be published. I think with some kinds of, modifications or revising of focus or something, I think this deserves a wider audience than right here. So I have some ideas about that, which maybe I'll mention in a moment, but I'll go through some of the things I admire about this first. I think your use of the English language here is really great throughout. Like it's very well written. And also, as Dr. Restifo mentioned, it's a very sort of hazardous conceptual terrain that you set out, that you sailed into, because it's easy on the one hand to kind of make very vague comparisons and say, oh, these two traditions are seeing the same thing and saying the same thing, end of story. And it's and you somehow managed to avoid doing that by finding these very specific conceptual bridges that were convincing to me, right? I'm not familiar with Jain philosophy especially, but the concepts that you brought out and that Dr. Restifo said you actually really discovered on your own within the sources, they're specific enough to really feel meaningful. And that was something that I wasn't sure you'd be able to find when you first described your project to me, but they did seem meaningful. And especially, I think, the fact that both traditions have this great emphasis on skepticism toward institutions, on the sort of democratization of mysticism, that their weight is in that, right? I mean, it's easy to find mystical traditions all around the world where truth is found within the self, right? That's all over the place. But mystical traditions that emphasize that the truth is not only found within the self, but it's found within you right now, and that you can find it through these techniques. And you don't need to pay attention to priests or scholarly systems. That was something that you played up throughout your work, and was a particularly striking and meaningful comparison between the two. I also like your choice to use Jain terms as a master category, rather than religious studies terms even sometimes. I think that made this have a sort of creative feel throughout. So I think I mean, I can go on saying nice things about it. But I think there's still a few places that you could, if you want to take this further. And again, I don't think you need to, but I think it deserves this. If you want to take this further, I think you can do a little bit more in suggesting mechanisms for the similarities between the two traditions. So you can say, you can do this historically and say, Watts was very interested in Asian thought, and it's possible that he was aware of Jain ideas, and this may have fit into his work in so and so and so and so moment. That's sort of a historical connection. And then there's also, of course, a metaphysical connection, which lurks behind this whole thing, which I think is that, you're implying that they are arriving at truth independently, but it's the same truth, right? That's fine. I mean, I think you have to be a bit deft about when you're presenting that kind of idea in an academic setting, but still not complete. Don't be completely shy about saying that. I think it has space in our current world. Another thing that I think you could do more of, if you want to, is sort of better historicize your psychonauts. Right? Because McKenna and Watts are very different generations, right? They're 30 years apart. Right. And they have different upbringings. I mean, Watts, he was educated in what, the 1930s or something, and McKenna was a child of the 60s and 70s, right?
Mhm.
So they have, I mean, obviously, even the quotes you pull out show very dramatically different ways of writing, but they probably have different sort of metaphysical underpinnings here too. And if you want to really, I mean, it would make it stronger, I think, if you fleshed out, if you historicized
Mhm.
that half, right? Those people a bit more, because one of your points that you're making, and I think this is another very creative point, is that psychedelic mysticism in the modern age has the qualities of a religion.
Mhm.
So if you want to subject it to that analytical lens, then I think you need to do less of a lumping it together and more of a sort of seeing the strands and different strands of psychedelic mysticism that are existing today.
Mhm.
That's one possible direction you can go in if you want to, work on finding a way to publish this, which again, I think it really does deserve. Yeah, so I think that's all I have to say, but I'm really impressed by this, especially knowing the time constraints with which you
Yeah.
put together the final draft. So
Very impressive.
congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay, now I think maybe Iqbal like to say something, Professor Akhtar.
Yeah, hey Maya, it's wonderful. I mean, I really enjoyed the work, even as we were discussing kind of in the early period, before Professor Estifo joined us. So I think one of the questions that I have for you is that, like, thinking about one of the things that we had discussed earlier was kind of so I think, like, almost all religious communities have this idea of an altered mental state, right? And so some believe that you can do it through prayer and meditation, some through, these sorts of like other means, psychedelics and stuff like that. What do you think ultimately is the, I, I mean, I kind of want to again push you a little bit further in a different way, but I mean, with kind of the Western engagement with the Jain tradition, what ultimately do people in the West want to get through the use of psychedelics? Like in
So
terms of like our sort of where our society and civilization is headed, where do you see kind of the next generation of people who are engaging with it, experimenting with it? Because we've talked kind of like about the earlier period. Where do you see young people who are engaging with this? Like, what do they exactly want to get out of it? And is it connected to other anxieties in our society, whether it's climate change and things like that? So I'd just be interested in hearing what you have to say.
I think it's definitely connected to all those things. Like I said, like in my presentation, I think so. Okay, this is like a loaded question. So, with the psychedelic experience, I feel like if young people just take it because they're at a music festival or
Definitely.
Okay, I don't know at what point I cut off.
Okay, yeah, I can hear you, yeah.
So, what I was kind of saying is that, so I think, so certain people, like young people today, may
Mm.
take it for purely like, I guess you could say hedonistic reasons, but just like I feel with every type of mysticism or mystical vision, you don't really like, it just happens to you, like the truth just becomes revealed.
Mhm,
So, I think that especially with the way that the world is now, these substances open up people to, deeper understandings of humanity, feeling compassion, unity with people, feeling a sense of like they have a purpose in the world and it's connected, and how things that they may do are gonna affect, everybody else too. So.
Okay,
Answered.
great. Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Yeah, overall, I mean, I think it was just really well done. And I think, because your work is like the field itself in this kind of comparative work is so in its, in its early stages. Did you get a chance to talk to Professor Parsons?
No, I did not
No,
get it.
okay, so that's something I would really suggest you do also is like, when you get a chance, try to Zoom with him, maybe send him your material. I think it would be interesting just to get his perspective and maybe some ideas about about going forward also with the work. Yeah, but it's great, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions? Yeah. go.
Yeah.
That's another question, but I want to praise you.
Thank
Yeah.
Because kind of reminds me of like, well, I don't know if it was on purpose, but or maybe inevitable given the question that you chose to pursue. But it's we found out to do with the psychotist when he was kind of demonstrating through philosophy that philosophy is not useful. And then at the end, it was like, oh, you have to kick down the ladder and whatever. But this notion that like our language is full of contrast, and it's full of compartmentalization, and there's all this nominalism, and how we understand the world is this kind of ripping it. Is a unity between and the psychedelic movement, and so it feels like this sort of demonstrative, performative, ostensive text, and I think that's really cool.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So one question, do you think that the concept of using the word would be like obviously you just try to stray away from it, right? You're saying supernatural and otherworldly, unworldly, or whatever it was, avoiding that, but I think the word supernatural was mentioned later, so I'm wondering if you think that that's just a given when it comes to the topic, or if that's something that like you try to avoid to talk about, but like it's gonna happen, like,
That's what it is. It's like inevitable. I feel like with religious studies, because with the terminology we have to categorize certain phenomena, what other word am I going to use besides putting a huge like a parenthesis, trying to kind of say what I'm pointing to, or using a word from another language. And that's what I try to do with these Sanskrit terms that are so much more rich with like conceptual ideas within them than what we use normally, like supernatural or altered.
It's an inevitability and the whole phenomenological what do you call it, discipline, right? Philosophy had to come up with all these terms.
Yeah.
They had to beingness.
We can't talk about it unless we like say a word, and then we reduce it, and it's like it's inevitable.
I would say maybe originally maybe just mentioning that part's you know what I mean, a given, right? Because it implied that you wouldn't see those words whatsoever. You understand?
I get you. I get what you're saying.
A critique necessarily, more like, okay, you might want to, because that's an important point, you know, you might want
Mhm.
to juxtapose that with it.
Thank you.
Wonderful. What do you think? Should we ask everyone to leave and yeah, speak a little bit in private?
It's
That's
the
what this-
symbolic